It started in Chicago, 1898. The son of an honest police officer grows up to build one of the largest bootlegging operations in the northwest suburbs. He fights off Al Capone. He refuses to give up his territory. Then, in 1933, he's accused of a kidnapping that could send him to prison for life. He beats the first case. The second one puts him away for 26 years. When he finally walks out of prison in 1959, he tells reporters he's been expecting what comes next. 3 weeks later, he's dead on the sidewalk outside his sister's house. This is the story of Roger Touhy. It began on the near west side of Chicago in a narrow stretch of working-class streets where Irish immigrants built lives out of brick, sweat and discipline. Roger Touhy was born on September the 18th, 1898, at 822 South Robie Street in Chicago, Illinois. He was the youngest of 8 children born to James A. Touhy and Mary Morrigan Touhy. His father was a patrolman in the Chicago Police Department, an Irish immigrant from County Sligo who carried a reputation for being fiercely honest at a time when police corruption was routine. James Touhy was known as incorruptible. He was also known as severe. Inside the Touhy household, discipline was strict and often violent. Neighbours complained about the beatings the children received. Mary Touhy, by contrast, was devout and unwavering in her faith. She required her children to attend Mass and raise them Roman Catholic. Roger served as an altar boy. In public, the family projected order and obedience. Behind closed doors, it was a hard upbringing. The Touhys lived near Polk Street and South Damon Avenue in Chicago's near west side, an area dense with immigrants, labourers, and street politics. Roger attended local public school. He was bright and disciplined enough to excel academically. That structure began to fracture in 1908. That year, Mary Touhy was killed in a kitchen accident when a stove exploded and caused a fire. Roger was 10 years old. After her death, James Touhy moved the family west to Downers Grove, Illinois, seeking distance from the city and perhaps from memories. There, Roger attended St. Joseph Catholic School. He graduated from the 6th grade as valedictorian of his class, a detail that stayed with him the rest of his life. But even in Downers Grove, the Touhy name would not remain clean. Of Roger's 6 brothers, all but one would drift into crime. James Touhy Jr. was shot and killed by a police officer in 1917 during an armed robbery. He died the way many young men in that era did, chasing fast money in a city that was beginning to organize its vice into structured empires. John Touhy entered bootlegging and was killed in 1927 by members of the Chicago Outfit, which at the time was led by Al Capone. His death was part of the violent consolidation of power that defined Chicago during Prohibition. Joe Touhy met his end in 1929. He had threatened a roadhouse owner named Victor Willett for refusing to buy moonshine from the Touhy operation. Willett shot and killed him. Tommy Touhy, known later as the Terrible, would serve prison time for robbery. Eddie Touhy, who worked as a bartender, appeared to avoid the criminal path that trapped his brothers. By the time Roger reached adulthood, 3 of his brothers were dead from violence connected to crime. Another would spend years behind bars. The lessons were visible. The risks were clear. The city had shown him what happened to men who played the game without control. Roger Touhy grew up in a household shaped by law enforcement on one side and lawlessness on the other. His father wore a badge. His brothers carried guns. Between those two worlds, Roger learned discipline, resentment, ambition, and survival. By 1917, as America entered the First World War, Roger Touhy stood at a crossroads. He had seen how crime could destroy a family. He had also seen how power worked in Chicago. The next choices he made would not be small ones. By 1915, Roger Touhy was still a teenager, but he was already working full-time. He had developed a hobby that set him apart from many boys his age. He was fascinated with radio. He built and operated a ham radio set, learning the language of dots and dashes that travelled invisibly through the air. That skill led him to a job with Western Union as a telegrapher. He proved adept at Morse code and efficient under pressure. Before long, he was managing the small office where he worked. It was his first taste of responsibility. It was also his first collision with authority outside his father's home. In 1915, Touhy expressed support for unionization efforts among telegraphers. The early 20th century was an era of labor unrest. Strikes and organizing drives were common, and employers often responded swiftly. Western Union dismissed him for his pro-union stance. Touhy later said he spent time as a union organizer for the Commercial Telegraphers Union of America, though he came to see that line of work as unstable. He shifted to the Order of Railroad Telegraphers, which offered steadier prospects. That move qualified him for a better-paying position with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Touhy left Illinois and went west to Colorado. It was his first significant departure from Chicago, a step into a broader world that was changing rapidly. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered the First World War. A year later, in 1918, Roger Touhy enlisted in the United States Navy. He did not see combat overseas. Instead, the Navy assigned him to a teaching post at Harvard University near Boston, Massachusetts. The university had provided classroom space to the Navy, and Touhy taught officers Morse code. For the rest of his life, he would tell people that he taught at Harvard. It carried a certain weight. The truth was more precise. He taught Navy officers on a campus temporarily repurposed for war. After leaving the Navy, Touhy did not return immediately to Chicago. He traveled to Oklahoma with a friend he had met in service. The oil business was booming. Fields were being opened, fortunes made, and lost in months. Touhy saw opportunity. He persuaded a petroleum engineer to spend several hours teaching him the fundamentals of the trade. Payment came in the form of a bottle of bootleg corn whiskey. Armed with limited technical knowledge and considerable confidence, Touhy bluffed his way into a petroleum engineering job. He relied heavily on drilling rig workers and mechanics, compensating them with liquor to handle the details he did not yet understand. Within about a year, he had saved $1,000. He and his Navy friend began speculating in oil leases. The gamble paid off. According to the record, Touhy made approximately $25,000 during his time in Oklahoma, a significant sum in the early 1920s. He returned to Chicago not as a street kid from the near West Side, but as a young man with capital and ambition. On April 22, 1922, Roger Touhy married Clara, a 23-year-old telegraph operator he had first met 7 years earlier while working for Western Union. The ceremony marked a transition. He had survived a strict childhood, watched brothers fall into crime, lost his mother, and navigated war and speculation. Now he was married, with money in hand and experience beyond his years. The question was how he would use it. The city he came back to was entering Prohibition. Opportunity was shifting from oil fields and telegraph wires to something far more volatile. When Roger Touhy returned to Chicago in the early 1920s, he did not step directly into the underworld. He entered the legitimate economy, and for several years he thrived in it. After his marriage to Clara on April 22, 1922, Touhy took on respectable work. By day, he became a successful automobile salesman. The automobile industry was expanding quickly, and Touhy proved to be persuasive, disciplined, and comfortable dealing with customers. According to contemporary accounts, he earned as much as $50,000 a year selling cars, an extraordinary income for the period. At night, he supplemented that work by driving a taxicab. On paper, it was the profile of an ambitious young businessman. Married, profitable, upwardly mobile. In 1927, Touhy formalized his ambitions by forming a trucking company with two of his brothers, Eddie Touhy and Tommy Touhy. The business was legitimate. It provided transportation services at a time when road freight was becoming more important across Illinois and the Midwest. That same year, Roger and Clara welcomed their first surviving son, Roger Scott Touhy. In 1927, Touhy also moved his family out of Chicago and into Des Plaines, Illinois, a suburb northwest of the city. At the time, Des Plaines was still largely rural. Touhy purchased a large home on a farm along River Road just north of Maryville Academy. It was a strategic relocation. The northwest suburbs were less congested, less scrutinized, and increasingly important to anyone looking to control the flow of goods into and out of Chicago. By then, the United States was deep into Prohibition. The 18th Amendment had been in effect since 1920. Alcohol was illegal, but demand had not disappeared. It had reorganized itself into a shadow market. According to Touhy's later account, he began bootlegging almost immediately after founding the trucking firm in 1927. The trucks provided ideal cover. Transportation was already his business. Liquor could move under that umbrella. Shortly thereafter, he formed a partnership with Matt Kolb, a bootlegger who owned a saloon near Touhy's automobile dealership. Kolb had previously been associated with the Chicago Outfit, led by Al Capone, and had once supplied a significant portion of the beer distributed by Capone's organization. As the outfit grew more violent, Kolb distanced himself. For an investment of $10,000, Touhy bought into Kolb's operation. It was a decisive shift. The trucking company gave Touhy logistics. Kolb gave him access to production and distribution. The partnership marked his formal entry into organized bootlegging. He was no longer skirting the edges of the trade. He was building a business inside it. By 1927, Roger Touhy had positioned himself in the northwest suburbs with infrastructure, capital, and a partner experienced in Chicago's alcohol underground. The move to Des Plaines was not accidental. It placed him outside the immediate center of outfit control, while still close enough to supply the city. The foundation was set. What followed would transform a trucking businessman into one of the most prominent bootleggers in the Chicago area. By the late 1920s, Roger Touhy was no longer experimenting in bootlegging. He was building infrastructure. After investing $10,000 into Matt Kolb's operation, Touhy moved quickly. Together, they expanded production across the northwest edge of Chicago. According to the record, the Touhy-Kolb partnership constructed 10 illegal breweries in the suburbs northwest of the city. These were not makeshift stills hidden in basements. They were organized production facilities designed to meet high demand. They also built a wooden barrel manufacturing plant in Schiller Park. Control of packaging meant control of distribution. It allowed them to scale without depending on outside suppliers. Touhy understood presentation. He purchased oil trucks and painted them to resemble Texaco vehicles, disguising shipments of beer and liquor as fuel deliveries. He hired off-duty police officers to drive the trucks, adding a layer of protection against inspection. When law enforcement pulled over what appeared to be a legitimate oil shipment driven by a police officer, scrutiny tended to soften. Unlike many bootleggers who cut corners, Touhy and Kolb hired a chemist to improve the quality of their beer. They aimed to produce something consistent and drinkable. In a market flooded with poor alcohol, quality created loyalty. Demand was strong. The partnership supplied approximately 200 bars, nightclubs, and roadhouses throughout the western and northwestern suburbs. They regularly sold 18,000 bottles of beer per week. During the summer months, when consumption peaked, they moved as many as 1,000 barrels weekly. On each $55 barrel, they cleared a profit of $50.50. The margins were substantial. Bootlegging was only one arm of the enterprise. In 1926, Touhy and Kolb entered the slot machine business. Though illegal, slot machines were widely accepted fixtures in drugstores, gas stations, grocery stores, and taverns. The pair placed hundreds of machines across their territory. In their first year alone, the slot operations grossed approximately $1 million. Touhy was careful about how he ran his territory. He became known as one of the most effective fixers in the Chicago area. Bribes flowed regularly to judges, police officers, and prosecutors. Payments were often supplemented with shipments of high-quality beer, sometimes more appreciated than cash. For prominent officials, Touhy even printed personalized labels on bottles delivered to them. He maintained control in other ways. He kept lower-level, volatile criminals out of Des Plaines. He refused to allow brothels to operate in the northwest and western suburbs under his influence. That policy distinguished him from the Chicago Outfit, which openly profited from prostitution and broader vice operations. Touhy also invested in public goodwill. He donated beer to civic and fraternal fundraisers. On Sundays, he bought ice cream for hundreds of local children. In communities where prohibition enforcement was inconsistent and often selective, gestures like that mattered. By 1930, the Touhy-Kolb organization was a structured operation. It had production facilities, a supply chain, transportation, protection from certain elements of law enforcement, and community influence. It was profitable and expanding. And it was operating on the edge of a city controlled by the Chicago Outfit. For a time, Touhy supplied beer to Al Capone's organization itself. Hundreds of barrels moved south into Outfit territory each week. It was a business relationship built on convenience. But in Chicago during Prohibition, territory and profit rarely remained settled for long. By the late 1920s, Roger Touhy's operation had grown too large to ignore. At first, his relationship with Al Capone's Chicago Outfit was transactional. Touhy supplied beer to the outfit in bulk. At one point, he was moving as many as 800 barrels a week to Capone at a discounted rate of $37.50 per barrel. Even at that price, the profit margin remained high. It was business, and for a time it worked. But Capone did not view territory as temporary. As the outfit consolidated control over Chicago, its interests expanded beyond liquor. Brothels, gambling rooms, and taxi dance halls followed wherever the outfit established influence. The northwest suburbs, where Touhy and Matt Kolb operated, were seen as untapped ground. Capone tested Touhy first through intermediaries. He sent Willie Heaney and Frank Rio to meet with him. The message was clear. The outfit believed the northwest suburbs were open for expansion into prostitution and gambling. Touhy refused. He had built his standing in those communities partly on keeping brothels out and maintaining a level of order. Allowing outfit vice operations would destabilize that balance. Touhy understood he could not match the outfit in manpower. Instead, he staged intimidation. In his office, he lined the walls with rifles and handguns. He borrowed submachine guns from local police officers. Off-duty officers and farmers lounged around the premises, visibly armed. During meetings, men would walk in, grab a weapon, and announce they were heading out to kill someone. Touhy would nod calmly. He arranged for staged phone calls, answering with short commands that implied violence was being ordered elsewhere. Heaney and Rio left convinced they were facing a large and ruthless organization. Word of the encounter spread. Touhy earned the nickname Touhy the Terrible. Capone sent a second delegation. Louis Little New York Campagna and Jack Machine Gun McGurn arrived to propose that Touhy surrender part of his business to the outfit. Once again, Touhy refused and repeated the display. The illusion held. Capone shifted tactics. Francis Frank Diamond Maritotti, Sam Golfbag Hunt, and Frank Rio approached Touhy again. This time, Rio was less impressed by the theatrics. Sensing danger, Touhy invited the outfit leadership to a supposed gathering at the Arch, his roadhouse in Schiller Park. He had no intention of holding a party. Instead, he closed the establishment early and removed the liquor. That evening, Chicago police and Cook County Sheriff's deputies raided the property, acting on a tip that had originated with Capone. The trap failed to damage Touhy. Capone attempted a more direct approach. Murray the Camel Humphreys met with Touhy and urged him to come to Cicero to meet with outfit underboss Frank Nitti. Touhy had been warned that the meeting would end in his murder. He declined and suggested that Nitti come to Schiller Park instead. When Humphreys pressed the issue, Touhy leveled a shotgun at him. Humphreys left, humiliated. On March 4th, 1931, another outfit emissary named Summers approached Touhy with the same proposal to open brothels and gambling in the suburbs. Touhy bribed two of his own men to take Summers drinking. They ended up at Capone's Cotton Club in Cicero, where Summers was goaded into picking a fight with Ralph Capone, who managed the club. During the altercation, two federal agents intervened and were disarmed. Touhy's men retained the agents' firearms. The situation created serious federal pressure. Capone urgently sought the return of the weapons. Touhy denied knowledge. Summers was later killed by the outfit. Federal authorities raided the Cotton Club on March 12th and 13th. Forcing its closure, the conflict shifted into open friction. Chicago Outfit members began traveling into the western and northwestern suburbs, engaging in sporadic gun battles with Touhy's men. It was not full-scale war, but it was escalating. Behind the scenes, political changes were also reshaping the landscape. On April 8, 1931, Anton Kermack was sworn in as mayor of Chicago. As chair of the Cook County Board of Commissioners, Cermak had maintained a workable relationship with Touhy. Now he publicly pledged to clean up the city's violent gangs. According to later accounts, Cermak suggested that a less violent organisation such as Touhy's could replace the outfit's dominance. Whether that understanding was formal or strategic remains debated, but the perception of alignment alarmed Capone. Capone responded by targeting Matt Kolb. While Touhy was in Florida in early 1931, Kolb was threatened with death unless he paid $25,000. He paid. Capone's men then kidnapped him. Touhy arranged $50,000 for Kolb's release. Soon after, outfit capos seized control of 40 of Kolb's bars, clubs and resorts in the northwest suburbs. Kolb's liquor was destroyed, his slot machines smashed, and managers were ordered to buy from Capone. On October 18th, 1931, just before 2 a.m., two outfit gunmen entered Kolb's club, Morton, in Morton Grove, and shot Matt Kolb to death. Kolb's murder shifted the balance. Touhy, now without his partner, surrounded himself with armed guards. The message from the outfit had changed. It was no longer negotiation or theatre, it was elimination. The confrontation between Roger Touhy and Al Capone had moved from business rivalry to survival. By 1930, the battleground in Chicago was shifting. Prohibition had created empires in liquor, but control of labor unions offered something even more valuable: leverage over entire industries. The Chicago outfit understood that controlling unions meant controlling trucking routes, construction contracts, waste hauling, and delivery networks. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters and various American Federation of Labor locals became targets. Whoever controlled those locals controlled the flow of goods across the city. Around 1929, Al Capone approached Roger Touhy with a proposal. The outfit intended to take over several Chicago area Teamster locals. Marcus Studdy Looney, representing the outfit, met with Touhy and showed him a list of AFL unions and the money held in their treasuries. The sums were substantial. The outfit wanted Touhy's assistance. Touhy declined. His refusal did not stop the outfit. By the fall of 1930, outfit figures were moving to seize control of independent Teamster locals. Some union leaders, fearing assassination or takeover, sought protection from non-outfit gangsters. A number of them purchased homes near Touhy's residence in Des Plaines, hoping proximity would deter violence. They hired bodyguards, many of whom had criminal backgrounds themselves. In 1931, several labor officials approached Touhy directly. William Rooney, president of the Sheet Metal Workers Union, Patrick J. Paddy Beryl, vice president of the Teamsters, and Art Wallace, secretary-treasurer of the Painters Union, met with him. They asked him to hold $125,000 that had been raised to resist outfit control. Touhy later claimed he safeguarded the money until Beryl and Jerry Horan of the Building Service Employees International Union retrieved it. The labor struggle intensified after Al Capone was imprisoned on October 24, 1931. With Capone behind bars, leadership within the outfit fractured. Lower-level figures fought for influence. One of those figures was George "Red" Barker, an Irish gangster affiliated with the outfit who had controlled several union locals since 1928. Barker used that influence to pressure the Sicilian faction that had dominated under Capone. In June 1932, Barker was murdered. Contemporary press reports attributed the killing to the Sicilian faction. Labor historian David Scott Whitwer later suggested that someone from Touhy's organization may have been responsible. The exact responsibility remains debated in historical accounts. In July 1932, Patrick J. Paddy Beryl was killed by the outfit. His murder was widely seen as retaliation within the ongoing labor power struggle. At the same time, Cook County State's Attorney Thomas J. Courtney, who took office in 1933, publicly claimed he intended to root out organized crime influence in labor. Historians have since concluded that Courtney engaged in behind-the-scenes arrangements involving both the AFL and the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. His chief investigator, Chicago Police Captain Daniel A. Gilbert, became central to efforts to restructure union leadership, installing figures acceptable to Courtney's office. Violence followed these shifts. On February 2nd, 1933, Tommy Touhy and other members of the Touhy organization attacked James Fur Sammons, a hitman associated with the O'Donnell gang and involved in labor racketeering. The attack did not result in fatalities, but it signaled that Touhy's men were willing to intervene directly in union conflicts. Frank Nitti, who had assumed greater authority within the outfit after Capone's imprisonment, responded with intimidation. A series of vandalism incidents and bombings targeted businesses and union-related sites. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be punished. Prohibition itself was nearing its end. On April 7th, 1933, the Cullen-Harrison Act legalized the sale of beer containing up to 3.2% alcohol by weight. Organized crime groups sought new ways to maintain revenue, including protection rackets targeting legal breweries. On April 8th, the Prima Brewing Company plant in Chicago was bombed. Some sources suggested Touhy's involvement, though the evidence was not conclusive. The most dramatic confrontation came later that month. On Friday, April 28th, 1933, at approximately 8:30 a.m., armed men carrying machine guns entered the Teamsters District Council headquarters at 637 South Ashland Avenue in Chicago. About 80 people were inside the building. They were held hostage for 3 hours. The leader of the gunmen declared that their objective was to break the control of Murray the Camel Humphreys, William Klondike O'Donnell, and Three-Finger Jack White over the Teamster unions. When those men did not appear as expected, the gunmen abducted Fred Sass, business agent of the Ash Wagon Drivers Union, and Morris Goldberg, a clerk for the Moving Van Drivers Union. Sass and Goldberg were held through the weekend. They were warned to resign their union positions or face death. They were released in the early hours of May 1st, 1933. Initial newspaper reports identified Roger Touhy as the leader of the armed group. Days later, reporting softened to state that members of the Touhy gang were responsible. Competing theories emerged. Some argued Touhy sought to seize union revenue as Prohibition profits declined. Others suggested he had been acting on behalf of union interests attempting to resist outfit domination. Another theory held that he needed funds for medical care for his brother Tommy, who had recently become partially paralyzed. What remains clear is that by the spring of 1933, the struggle for labor control in Chicago had become as volatile as the liquor wars that preceded it. Union halls were contested ground, political offices were entangled, law enforcement figures were implicated. Roger Touhy had moved from bootlegging into a conflict that reached into the foundations of the city's economy. And within weeks, a kidnapping hundreds of miles away would alter the course of his life permanently. By the summer of 1933, the labor wars were still smouldering when a kidnapping in Minnesota shifted the focus onto Roger Touhy. In late December 1931, Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker, along with Fred's mother, had settled in St. Paul, Minnesota. There, Karpis and Barker organized what became known as the Barker-Karpis Gang. They were experienced criminals operating in a period when kidnapping had become a lucrative enterprise. By 1933, high-profile abductions had more than doubled from the previous year. Ransom offered high reward with less immediate risk than bank robbery. In early June 1933, a local St. Paul figure named Jack Pfeiffer met with leaders of the Barker-Karpis gang and suggested a target. William Hamm Jr., president of the Hamm's Brewing Company and heir to the Hamm family fortune, was believed to be worth a substantial ransom. The figure discussed was $100,000. Shortly after 12:15 p.m. on June 15, 1933, William Hamm Jr. was kidnapped as he walked from the brewery to his home in St. Paul. The abduction was carried out by Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker, assisted by Arthur Doc Barker, Byron Bolton, Charles Old Fitzgerald, and Fred Gertz. At the time, Tom Brown, a former St. Paul police chief who had become a detective, was secretly providing information to the gang about investigative developments. The Hamm family paid the $100,000 ransom on June 17th. At dawn on June 19th, Hamm was released. The Federal Bureau of Investigation under Special Agent in Charge Melvin Purvis directed the investigation. From the outset, Purvis believed that Roger Touhy's organization was responsible for the kidnapping. Whether this belief developed independently or was influenced by information from Chicago authorities remains a matter of historical debate. Captain Daniel Gilbert of the Chicago Police Department told Purvis that Chicago police intelligence indicated Touhy was behind the crime. Evidence linking Touhy to the kidnapping was thin. Nevertheless, suspicion hardened quickly. On June 30th, 1933, another disappearance complicated the situation. John Jake the Barber Factor, a stock manipulator and associate of the Chicago outfit, vanished. Factor was facing extradition to the United Kingdom on stock fraud charges. There were immediate suspicions that his disappearance might be staged. The British consul publicly suggested the kidnapping was a farce. Even so, Captain Gilbert accused Touhy of orchestrating Factor's abduction as well. The accusation deepened federal attention. Unconcerned about the public statements being made against him, Touhy left Chicago in mid-July for a fishing trip in southern Wisconsin with Edward Father Tom McFadden, Gustav Gloomy Gus Schaefer, and Willie Sharkey. On July 19, 1933, as they were returning to Chicago, Touhy's car skidded off the road in rainy weather near Elkhorn, Wisconsin, and struck a utility pole. Touhy reported the accident and attempted to pay for the damage. During the routine investigation, local police discovered weapons inside the vehicle. Touhy and the three men with him were arrested on concealed weapons charges. Melvin Purvis travelled to Wisconsin and took custody of the four men without obtaining an extradition order. They were transported to Minnesota. The FBI publicly claimed to have an ironclad case linking Touhy to the Hamm kidnapping. The evidence did not immediately support that claim. Taxi driver Leo J. Allison failed to identify any of the four men as the individual who had delivered a ransom note. Hamm himself was secretly brought to view the suspects and did not identify them as his kidnappers. Unable at that stage to establish a direct connection to the Factor case either, the men were temporarily returned to Wisconsin to face the weapons charges. As Touhy sought legal relief, Purvis escalated. He added a conspiracy charge indicating additional charges would follow if necessary to prevent release. Touhy later alleged that federal agents beat him and deprived him of sleep in an effort to force a confession. On August 8, 1933, the United States Department of Justice convened a federal grand jury in St. Paul. Testimony was presented from arresting officers, the Walworth County Sheriff, Chicago police officers, and William Hamm Jr. himself. On August 12, 1933, the grand jury indicted Roger Touhy, Edward McFadden, Gustav Schaefer, and Willie Sharkey on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy to kidnap, and interstate transportation of a person held for ransom under the Federal Kidnapping Act. The indictment did not require the government to disclose the evidence against them. In public statements, federal authorities portrayed Touhy as a ruthless gang leader, commanding more than 100 killers. They alleged he operated a vast kidnapping ring across the Midwest. The language was sweeping and severe. Behind the scenes, another development was unfolding. On September 6, 1933, the FBI's Technical and Research Laboratory lifted fingerprints from the Hamm ransom notes. The prints matched members of the Barker Karpis gang, including Alvin Karpis and Doc Barker. Despite that discovery, the prosecution against Touhy continued. By August 1933, Roger Touhy had shifted from suburban bootlegger and labor power broker to federally indicted kidnapper. The stage was set for a trial that would test not only his freedom, but the credibility of the case built against him. By November 1933, the federal government was ready to prove that Roger Touhy was the architect of the William Hamm Jr. kidnapping. The trial opened on November 9, 1933, in the United States District Court for the District of Minnesota. Presiding over the proceedings was Judge Matthew M. Joyce. The lead prosecutor was Joseph B. Keenan, a special assistant to the Attorney General who had recently secured convictions in other high-profile kidnapping cases. The government intended to demonstrate that Touhy and his co-defendants, Edward Father Tom McFadden, Gustav Gloomy Gus Schaefer, and Willie Sharkey, had orchestrated and executed the abduction of the Hamm Brewery executive. 9 jurors were seated. The government's central witness was William Hamm Jr. On the first day of testimony, Hamm identified McFadden as one of the men involved in his kidnapping. The next day, he recanted. When asked to identify Willie Sharkey, Hamm was unable to do so. He did describe a Wisconsin road sign he claimed to have seen while being transported, which the prosecution argued placed his confinement within the state. Other eyewitnesses proved uncertain. Daniel Rush, who had observed the kidnapping from his home, could not positively identify any of the defendants. Under questioning, he stated only that Sharkey resembled the driver of the car used in the abduction. Taxicab driver Leo J. Allison, who had delivered a ransom note, initially resisted identifying anyone. Treated as a hostile witness, he eventually said that the man who handed him the note resembled McFadden. Dentist Dr. Horace C. La Bissonnière and drugstore owner Clarence J. Thomas both testified that Touhy resembled the man who had delivered a ransom note to Thomas's store. Neither could make a positive identification. The prosecution did secure two stronger identifications. Printer Walter Bowick, who had been inside the drugstore when a ransom note was delivered, positively identified Touhy as the man responsible. Farmhand Charles Carlson testified that he had seen Touhy, McFadden and Schaefer loitering near the site where ransom money was dropped. Carlson maintained his identification despite extensive cross-examination. Law enforcement officers also testified about weapons found in Touhy's vehicle at the time of his arrest in Wisconsin. They described items characterized as kidnapping gear, including a sash, rubber boots, and bandages. The defense began presenting its case on November 17th. For 3.5 days, depositions were read into the record from individuals who stated they had seen Touhy and his co-defendants far from Minneapolis at the time of the kidnapping. Touhy's defense rested heavily on an alibi for June 15th and 16th. Des Plaines attorney Vincent Connor testified that he had met with Touhy on the night of June 16th, the same evening a ransom note was delivered in Minnesota. Connor stated that he had telephoned Touhy at his home on June 15th as well. Telephone records were introduced to support this claim. Edward J. Meany, a Des Plaines realtor and insurance broker, testified that he had also met with Touhy in Des Plaines on June the 15th. During the trial, Connor and Meany were briefly arrested by local police for allegedly violating a hotel registration ordinance. Judge Joyce reacted sharply and ordered their release, viewing the arrests as improper. Gustav Schaefer presented his own alibi. He claimed he was at a motel in King City, California during the week of the Hamm kidnapping. Depositions from motel clerks were introduced, along with postcards postmarked June 21st and 22nd that Schaefer had sent to his wife from California and Wyoming. 2 handwriting experts testified that Schaefer had written the postcards. Touhy's wife, Clara, also testified. She explained that the sash cord found in the car was a clothesline rope used by their children, that the bandages were rags used to clean up after car sickness, and that the rubber boots belonged to her. The defense rested on November the 25th. The prosecution sought to recall Hamm to identify his kidnappers by voice and attempted to introduce additional witnesses, including John Jake the Barber factor. Judge Joyce denied these requests, ruling that such testimony should have been presented during the government's primary case. On November 28, 1933, after deliberating for 6.5 hours, the jury returned its verdict. Roger Touhy, Edward McFadden, Gustav Schaefer and Willie Sharkey were acquitted of the kidnapping of William Hamm Jr. For Touhy, it was a decisive legal victory. The federal government had publicly portrayed him as the leader of a sprawling kidnapping enterprise. The jury was not convinced, but the acquittal did not bring freedom. Even as the Hamm case collapsed, the separate prosecution tied to the disappearance of Jake factor was waiting. While Roger Touhy was fighting the Hamm indictment in federal court, another case was forming around him, one that would ultimately decide his fate. On June 30th, 1933, John Jake the Barber Factor disappeared. Factor was a Chicago stock manipulator and an associate of the Chicago Outfit. At the time of his disappearance, he was facing extradition to the United Kingdom on stock fraud charges. Almost immediately, suspicions surfaced that the kidnapping might not be what it appeared to be. The British consul publicly suggested it was staged. Even so, the case gained momentum. Shortly after Touhy's arrest in Elkhorn, Wisconsin on July 19, 1933, police secretly arranged a lineup. Touhy, Edward McFadden, Gustav Schaefer and Willie Sharkey stood before Factor. He failed to identify any of them as his kidnappers. Factor then told authorities that his captors were demanding additional money and threatening to abduct him again. FBI Special Agent Melvin Purvis arranged to monitor Factor's telephone calls. When a new ransom payment was organised for August 15th in St. Paul, law enforcement set a trap. Basil the Owl Bangert and Charles Icewagon Connors appeared at the drop site. Sensing the setup, they opened fire and escaped despite a heavy police presence and aerial surveillance. Meanwhile, Captain Daniel Gilbert of the Chicago Police Department publicly claimed that eyewitnesses had seen Touhy's associates near the Dells Roadhouse, where Factor was allegedly abducted. On November 9th, 1933, a grand jury indicted Basil Banghart, Charles Icewagon Connors, and August John Lamar for participating in the kidnapping. Banghart was later captured in Baltimore on February 11th, 1934. Immediately after Touhy's acquittal in the Hamm case on November 28, 1933, federal authorities arrested him and his co-defendants on charges related to the Factor kidnapping. Willie Sharkey, who had displayed erratic behaviour during the Hamm proceedings, committed suicide by hanging on November 30th, 1933. Touhy's trial for the kidnapping of Jake Factor opened on January 16th, 1934. Thomas Courtney, serving as Minnesota's state's attorney in the prosecution, persuaded President Franklin D. Roosevelt not to deport Factor, arguing that his presence was necessary for law enforcement purposes. The state called 6 eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Touhy and his associates abduct Factor. Factor himself took the stand. He testified that although he had been blindfolded, the blindfold slipped at one point, allowing him to see Touhy. Under cross-examination, he was confronted with his failure to identify Touhy in the earlier lineup. Factor responded that Captain Gilbert had instructed him not to identify anyone at that time. Touhy presented an alibi. Several neighbours testified that he had been sitting on the front porch of his home in Des Plaines on the evening of Factor's alleged kidnapping. On February 2, 1934, the jury announced it was deadlocked. A mistrial was declared. A second trial began on February 13, 1934. By then, the prosecution's strategy had shifted. Charges were dropped against Charles Connors, and the case against McFadden was Enol Prost. Basil Banghart and Isaac Ike Costner were brought in to testify. Costner turned state's evidence. He fully corroborated Factor's accusations, claiming Touhy had directed the kidnapping. Banghart testified for the defense. He claimed that Jake Factor had orchestrated his own kidnapping to avoid extradition to Britain, and that Banghart had been paid $50,000 for his role. According to Banghart, Factor and others later framed Touhy to solidify the story. His testimony was met with skepticism. Contemporary press accounts reported that even members of the court reacted with visible disbelief. The jury deliberated only 4 hours before returning a verdict. Roger Touhy was convicted of kidnapping. The jury rejected the death penalty but imposed a life sentence. Under Minnesota law, he would not be eligible for parole for 33 years. Basil Banghart was tried separately. On March 13, 1934, he was convicted and sentenced to 99 years in prison. On the same day, Charles Connors was found murdered in the Forest Preserve area of Cook County, Illinois. With the conviction in place, Roger Touhy was transferred to the Illinois State Penitentiary at Stateville. The man who had survived Prohibition wars, labor battles, and a federal acquittal now faced the remainder of his life behind bars. The courtroom had done what gunfire and intimidation had not. It had removed him from the streets. By early 1934, Roger Touhy was no longer a suburban power broker or a courtroom defendant. He was an inmate inside the Illinois State Penitentiary at Stateville, near Joliet. He entered prison under a life sentence for the kidnapping of John Jake the Barber Factor. Over time, he would spend most of his remaining fortune on appeals. But inside Stateville, daily survival came first. By the end of May 1934, much of the Touhy organization had been dismantled. Several associates were dead. Others were serving long sentences. Basil the Owl Banghart, who had also received a 99-year sentence in the Factor case, was initially held at Menard. After an escape from Menard in 1935, he was transferred to Joliet, where he reunited with Touhy. For years they watched. Banghart, who had 4 prior escapes on his record, studied the prison's routines. He observed guard rotations, tower placements, wall heights, weapons carried, distances between posts. He learned that rifles were sighted at 100 yards, even though the towers stood roughly 300 yards apart. He memorized details the way other men memorized prayers. By 1942, the plan matured. Touhy and Banghart recruited Edward Big Ed Darlak, a 32-year-old lifer serving a 199-year sentence for murder. Through Darlak's brother Casimir, 2.45 caliber revolvers and ammunition were obtained. In August 1942, the guns were tossed into bushes near the prison wall and smuggled inside by a trustee assigned to lower the prison flag each evening. The firearms were wrapped inside the folded flag and carried through the gate. Touhy, Banghart and Darlak brought in 4 more long-term inmates willing to risk everything: William Stewart, Eugene Lantorn, St. Clair McInerney and Martelick Nelson. Shortly before 1 p.m. on October 9th, 1942, the break began. Touhy assaulted the driver of a prison garbage truck and took control of the vehicle. He drove it to the mechanical shop where Lantorn was working. The 7 men overpowered guards, cut telephone wires, seized ladders and forced 2 guards to accompany them as hostages. Touhy and Banghart brandished the .45 caliber revolvers. Lantorn carried a Molotov cocktail fashioned inside the prison. The truck sped toward the northwest corner of the yard, stopping beneath tower number 3. One of the escapees fired at the guard in the tower, forcing compliance. Ladders were thrown against the wall. Touhy led 5 men into the tower, disarmed the guard and seized keys to the tower gate and to the guard's personal automobile parked outside the wall. Nelson descended the outer wall by rope, unlocked the tower gate, and the men fled to the waiting car. From the tower, they took 2 high-powered rifles and another handgun. Within minutes, they were on the Cinder Road heading towards Chicago. 8 p.m. that night, the stolen car broke through a police blockade at Elmhurst. By 11 p.m., the vehicle was abandoned in Villa Park, left deliberately in the open. The men then fled on foot into the Cook County Forest Preserve, hiding in a shack for 4 days. Banghart left at night to steal food. On October 13th, Banghart returned with another stolen automobile and moved the group to a West Side apartment on 13th Street. They posed as long-distance truck drivers. For nearly 2 months, they lived together in hiding. Banghart ruled the apartment with strict control. Drinking was limited. Outside contact was restricted. When one man went out for supplies, Banghart followed armed with a sawed-off shotgun concealed in newspaper. They changed clothes frequently and walked facing traffic to avoid being surprised from behind by police vehicles. Their plans were ambitious. They hoped to raise enough money through robberies to purchase a farm near Chicago for a permanent hideout. They wanted legitimate automobiles to avoid suspicion. They even discussed plastic surgery to alter their appearances and destroy identifiable features, including fingerprints. The estimated cost was $100,000. Internal fractures began to show. Around December 1st, Stewart and Nelson returned to the apartment intoxicated. Banghart disarmed and pistol-whipped both men, beating them unconscious. Fearing exposure, the remaining 5 fled and hid briefly in a garage before relocating to another apartment at 1256 Leland Avenue. The FBI did not immediately join the search after the October 9th escape because the fugitives had violated only state law. That changed after a week when they failed to register under the Selective Service Act, making them draft delinquents. Federal warrants were issued. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally directed the investigation from Washington. Agents combed through prison records, reviewed files from the Factor kidnapping, traced relatives, former associates, attorneys, and acquaintances. Photographs and descriptions were distributed nationwide and to Canadian and Mexican authorities. Border alerts were posted. The Bureau analysed patterns. They predicted Banghart would try to keep the group together in Chicago and that the men would commit small robberies to obtain identification papers. The first break came on December 15th, 1942, when Martelick Nelson attempted to contact a relative in Minneapolis. Agents located him the following day in a hotel room, lying in bed with a loaded gun under his pillow and the door barricaded with a chair. He had registered under the name Harold Seeger, the identity of a Chicago grocer recently robbed of his wallet. That same day, December 16th, agents located William Stewart in Chicago. He had been using the alias James Shea, another robbery victim's identity. Stewart, who disguised himself by dressing in black and carrying a Bible, was taken into custody. The remaining fugitives were tracked through informants, surveillance, and coordinated law enforcement efforts. Within weeks, Touhy and several others were discovered living in a Chicago boarding house. Touhy and 3 companions surrendered peacefully. 2 others attempted to resist and were killed in the confrontation. On December 31st, 1942, Roger Touhy was returned to Stateville. For the escape, he received an additional 199-year sentence. The prison walls he had scaled now stood higher than before, reinforced not only by concrete and steel, but by the certainty that federal authorities would never again underestimate him. By the early 1950s, Roger Touhy had spent nearly 2 decades inside Stateville Correctional Center. The man, once described by federal agents as a nationwide kidnapping mastermind, had become a long-term inmate, filing motions, studying transcripts, and pressing appeals. In 1949, Touhy initiated a federal habeas corpus proceeding, challenging the legality of his imprisonment. He alleged that his conviction in the Jake Factor kidnapping had been secured through conspiracy, fraud, and perjured testimony. Central to his claim was Isaac Ike Costner, the witness who had turned state's evidence during the second Factor trial and whose testimony had directly implicated Touhy. On August 9, 1954, Federal District Court Judge John Barnes issued a ruling that sent shockwaves through the case. The court found that Captain Daniel Gilbert of the Chicago Police Department had induced Costner to commit perjury. It also concluded that Gilbert had suppressed evidence favourable to Touhy. The ruling stated that prosecutorial misconduct had tainted the conviction and acknowledged that it was widely known by then that Jake Factor's kidnapping had been staged. Judge Barnes ordered Touhy released. On August 10, 1954, after more than 20 years behind bars, Roger Touhy walked free. The freedom lasted 48 hours. The state of Minnesota appealed, arguing that Touhy had not exhausted all available state remedies before seeking federal relief. The United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit ordered him returned to prison while the appeal was pending. On August 30, 1954, the Seventh Circuit ruled he should remain incarcerated until the matter was fully resolved. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene on February 14, 1955. Touhy went back to Stateville. The legal battle continued, then politics intervened. On July 31, 1957, Illinois Governor William Stratton commuted Touhy's sentences. The original 99-year term for the Factor kidnapping was reduced to 72 years. The additional 199-year sentence for the 1942 escape was reduced to 3 years. On February 20th, 1958, Touhy was granted parole on the kidnapping conviction. His 3-year escape sentence began running afterward. He became eligible for parole after serving 1/3 of that term. On November 12, 1959, parole was granted. 12 days later, on November 24, 1959, Roger Touhy walked out of Stateville Prison. He had served exactly 25 years and 9 months. He was 61 years old. He moved into his sister Ethel Alicia's home at 125 North Lotus Avenue in Chicago. His wife Clara and their sons had lived under assumed names for years during his imprisonment. Touhy emerged into a city that had changed. Prohibition was long gone. The outfit still existed, but leadership had evolved. Old alliances had hardened into quiet understandings. In the fall of 1959, his autobiography, The Stolen Years, was published. In it, Touhy detailed his account of the prosecutions and the alleged conspiracy that had framed him. Jake Factor filed a libel suit in response to statements made in the book. Less than a month after his release, the past returned. On December 16, 1959, at approximately 10:30 p.m., Roger Touhy and Walter Miller, a retired Chicago police detective who was acting as his bodyguard, approached the front steps of the Lotus Avenue home. As they reached the entrance, 2 or 3 men stepped from the shadows. Miller identified himself as a police officer. The gunmen produced 12-gauge shotguns from beneath their overcoats and opened fire. Touhy was struck in the left leg above the knee and in the right leg below the knee. Miller was shot 3 times in the arms and legs, but managed to draw his revolver and fire 5 shots in return. Both men were rushed to hospitals. Miller was taken to Loretto Hospital in critical condition. Touhy was transported to St. Anne's Hospital. He died on the operating table roughly an hour later from loss of blood. A priest administered last rites shortly before his death. According to reports, as he was placed in an oxygen tent, Touhy told those nearby, "I've been expecting it. The bastards never forget." He was buried on December the 18th, 1959, in a quiet graveside service at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. No clergy officiated, no police were present. The man who had battled Al Capone, challenged federal prosecutors, escaped to maximum security prison and fought for 25 years to clear his name, was killed within weeks of regaining his freedom. His legal challenges left a legacy. The federal procedures governing how government agents respond to subpoenas in litigation became known as the Touhy Regulations, named after the case that bore his name. In death, as in life, Roger Touhy remained entangled in the machinery of law, politics, and organized crime.